Let's begin. I'm Claire Appleby and I'm the Architecture Advisor at Theatres Trust, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Understanding Heritage Projects. This is the first webinar in a series as part of our Resilient Theatres, Resilient Communities programme. We're in the first year of this 3-year funded project. It's been generously funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, as well as funding from the Pilgrim Trust and the Swire Charitable Trust. The Resilient Theatres, Resilient Communities programme includes 3 webinars each year, and all are open to anyone to attend. The next is going to be programmed in the summer around about July time, and that webinar will be on finance and fundraising. Details are going to be shared next month via our website, newsletter and social media. So please do keep an eye out for those details and come and join us again. So some quick housekeeping notes before we start. Please can I ask you all to turn off your videos and microphones during the event. We also do request that attendees keep these settings for the duration of the event so that everybody can hear our speakers clearly and without interruption. We are recording this event and we will be sharing a link to the edited video with all attendees, and we hope to do that by the end of next week. We'll also share the slides from today's webinar. We have enabled captioning for the webinar, and if you'd like to make use of this, please select Live Transcript. That's the small CC button at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, at the bottom of your screens there. If you have any technical issues at all, please do use the chat box to send your message to the Theatres Trust host directly, not to everybody in the chat. And a member of our team will do their very best to assist you. We'll have around 20 to 30 minutes at the end for audience questions, and we invite you to type your comments and questions into the chat. Where relevant, please do indicate which speaker your query is directed at. And then finally, and really importantly, we really do value your feedback. This is a pilot project and the first webinar in the series, so we'd be really grateful if you could take a few minutes at the end to complete a short online survey. We'll email you a link to that survey shortly after the event. Thanks very much for that. So before I hand over to today's speakers, a really quick introduction. Today's webinar is all about creating a greater understanding of heritage projects, and more specifically, an introduction to planning a project in a listed building. The seminar is also going to touch on issues that will be useful for historic and locally listed buildings or buildings in conservation areas. And we're also going to explore the value of looking beyond the building's fabric and how to consider telling broader heritage stories, such as using archives and capturing community voices. We have 3 great speakers lined up for you today. Firstly, we have Theatres Trust's National Planning Advisor, Tom Clark, who will be demystifying the planning process for heritage buildings. Then we're going to hear from independent consultant Jenny Wetton, who will be explaining about heritage statements and conservation management plans, outlining why they are so important and how they can really help inform our building projects. And finally, heritage participation and public engagement consultant Chloe Bird will look at the different heritage stories that theatres can tell. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our National Planning Advisor, Tom Clark. And for those of you who haven't met or worked with Tom, he is our expert in planning, all planning matters at Theatres Trust. He manages all of the statutory planning casework referred to Theatres Trust for consultation by local authorities, and provides advice and guidance to theatre owners, operators, developers, planning officers and community groups on planning applications for theatres and developments which may impact theatre buildings. Over to you, Tom.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm very conscious that some of you probably don't have that many dealings with the planning system, so I'll just take you through some of the basics today. So what is the planning system? I think that this little paragraph from the planning portal, which is a very useful website, which I encourage you to look at if you are starting to look at any projects of any nature, whether it's with your theatre or even projects at home. That says that the planning control is the process of managing the development of land and buildings. The purposes of this process is to save what is best of our heritage and to improve the infrastructure upon which we depend for a civilised existence. Essentially, if you are looking to do any works that would require any kind of consent, you need to be applying to your local authority. And the planning system, whether you're in England, Wales, Scotland, or Northern Ireland, it's based on what's called a plan-led system, whereby at the very top level, you've got national planning policies and legislation. And below that, each local authority, so wherever you are, will have a plan for its area. And that talks about how many homes are needed, what type of employment space, for example, but it also sets policies on different types of development. So if you're looking at projects, you need to make sure that you're broadly consistent with the policies for your local area. There are different types of planning applications as well. In some cases, you might need to apply for more than one of these. So the planning permission is kind of the most common type. But where you're in listed buildings, there's particular works that you can't undertake that perhaps you could if you weren't listed. So you need what's called a listed building consent as well. And quite often you might need planning permission and listed building consent as well. Or sometimes just listed building consent if it's something that's not otherwise covered by, that's otherwise allowed. Advertisement consent is another one that's quite common for theatres. You know, if you're changing the nature of your signage or poster boards or putting in LED screens, which seems to be quite a common one now, often you need advertisement consent. And there's a few other types as well that are less common, but nonetheless, I mean, somebody might have trees on your property and you might be in the conservation area, in which case you need permissions before you do works to your trees. Permissive development is another one as well that allows you to undertake some works without need for planning permission whatsoever. Like I say, it's more restricted within listed buildings. Sometimes you might just need to contact the council first before you do this. It's called prior approval. But I mean, if you ever had any queries on what type of consent you might need, then do get in contact with us. If you are looking at carrying out works, I mean, there's a few basic questions here that you need to think about. So where are you in the country? Because actually England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales have, although overall the planning system is quite similar, there are differences between them. Each have their own national frameworks. And there's some things you are allowed to do in some but not others. For example, in England, under permitted development, you can put solar panels on your roofs, unless you're a listed building. Whereas in Scotland, that's not coming in likely until next year. And in Wales, that doesn't exist at all, and Northern Ireland. What is the status of your buildings? Like I say, if you're a listed building, then actually what you can do without permission is a lot more stringent than if you're not a listed building. And also, what's the status of the land around you? So are you in a conservation area, for example? Again, that might just have an impact on the types of works you can do and the impact it would have on the surrounding setting, not just your building, but other perhaps heritage assets around you. Also, how big is your project, and where your building is the project? Because, like I say, you might need to do more than one simultaneous application. So if your building isn't listed, that gives you a lot more flexibility to carry out works without permission, particularly internally. But just because you can, it doesn't necessarily mean you should. Just because you can do internal works, it doesn't. You need to be careful that you're not interrupting or damaging, important historic features that are nonetheless of interest and importance, even though they haven't been given that statutory recognition. On the plus side, like I say, you might be able to benefit from what called permitted development, right? So you could, for instance, put solar panels on your roofs without permission and other bits and pieces. There are slightly different rules as well, like saying in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, which you just need to be a bit careful of. And if your building is listed, obviously there's different categories. So in England and Wales, you've got grade 1, grade 2 star and grade 2. Most listed buildings are grade 2. Grade 1 and 2 star of those that really are of particular significance. Whereas in Scotland, it's category A, B or C. And Northern Ireland has a few different categories as well, from A, B+, B, B1, B2. And I mean, like I'm sure you're aware, these buildings are listed because of their particular historic or architectural interest. And so therefore, again, you need to be very sensitive when you are looking at works. And that in turn will guide the level of detail that you need to submit with your application and the different types of documents that you need to be submitting. Basically, with the list of buildings, if everything's internal, then you'd only really need to be looking at list of building consents. But for external works, then you likely need planning permission and list of building consent. This gives an overview of when the different types of consents might be required. I mean, planning permission, it's new buildings, extensions, any or most external alterations, amalgamation of different units into one. We've had quite a few of these recently where theatres have taken on, for instance, neighbouring shops and they've brought them into their building, or change of use to or from a theatre. So perhaps if you own a building and you're looking to turn it into a theatre or arts venue, you need permission to turn it into that. Likewise, if you're converting from a theatre to something else, you'd need planning permission. There's some basic requirements that you need to be submitting with that. So you'd have your application form, prep fees, which there's levels depending on the types of work and again where you are in the country. And submission of plans showing your site boundary marked out in a red line, and also your existing proposed floor plans and elevation showing the works you're doing. And I mean, the more detail you provide, the better it is. You know, not just with consultees such as us, we can understand your plans better, but you want to be helping the planning officer. You don't want to be creating delays by missing out information or having things that aren't particularly clear to them. And again, depending on the scale of the projects, slightly bigger works, you might need things like design and access statements, planning statements. In some cases, you may need particular specialist assessments that you need other consultants to do for you. You know, things like noise, environment, ecology, if you've got bats, that kind of thing within your building. You might need to be considering, you know, those additional submissions. List building consent, it's brought the same basic requirements. But you'd also need heritage statement, and again, the level of detail within this will be kind of reflective of the scale of the works. But you're going to hear a lot more about heritage statements and what you should be including later on in the presentation. But I mean, again, depending on what's happening, things like condition reports might be useful as well. Demolition plans which show where material is being removed from. So again, it helps decision makers to understand what fabric is coming in or out. And then just adverse consent, like I say, is another one. There are a few differences between the nations, but these are the broad kind of triggers for needing advertisement consent. Generally, you wouldn't need it if it's just for a like-for-like replacement, same size and similar standards. So I mean, if you're constantly removing one poster showing, you know, for a show for another one, that wouldn't need consent. But if you're taking out one poster board and putting in a totally different type, particularly if it's in a listed building, then you would likely need advertisement consent, possibly listed building consent as well. And there are just some other, you know, like I say, slightly less common application types, things like works to trees, prior approval. Also, if you're in Wales, there's conservation area consent. If you've got walls, railings, etc., that you're looking to take down, you would need permission for that as well. As well as demolition within conservation areas, that applies to all the nations. So how do you put your application together? Like I'm saying, level of detail would be broadly proportionate to your project. You know, it's in your interest to make sure that you've got the right detail, you've got clear plans, and you are meeting the basic requirements. Otherwise, your application won't be validated, which means kind of made live by the planning authority, and it will create unnecessary delays for you. You know, particularly if you've got quite tight timescales to do your works, because I know a number of theatres like to do them in periods where they're dark or, you know, between shows, depending on the nature of it. It's advisable to seek some advice before you submit your applications. All authorities offer a pre-application service. Some, if it's for quite minor works or perhaps it's for charitable organisation, might give you some free advice. Otherwise, there are paid for services, and there are benefits to this because it helps iron out any particular or potential issues, before you go through the full expense of submitting a planning application. Then again, potentially it reduces delays to you as well, because rather than plans being submitted and then it being pointed out to you that there's quite fundamental things that need amendment or revision, you can do that beforehand. And again, Theatres Trust is a resource that you can talk to. We can provide advice and guidance on your plans, informal comment before you submit to the council. Once you have submitted your application to be validated, then there's a period of around 8 weeks before it would be determined. And in that period, there'll be consultation. So you get, I'm sure you're quite common with site notices that will go on to lampposts in your area saying that the planning application is submitted. During that period, people have an opportunity to comment. We're what's called a statutory consultation. We should be notified by local authorities when there's applications for theatres. So people like us, Historic England, or other consultancies, Canal and Rivers Trust, if you're around the canal, there's a few others that will have an input on the planning process. And again, like I say, you can sometimes be asked for additional information to help the authorities come to a decision. And decisions are either made by what's called delegated authority, which is the planning officer themselves make a decision, or sometimes because of the scale or there's particular opposition or someone's asked for it, the council's asked for it to be called in, it might be decided by planning committee. Hopefully you do have a positive relationship with your planning officer, and that any problems are communicated to you in a timely manner, so that you can potentially be resolved. But sometimes objections are received that perhaps you're not expecting, and there are for reasonable purposes. Sometimes, hopefully you should have an opportunity to work through that. If the issues are too fundamental to sort out, you might be asked to withdraw the application to avoid it being refused. Alternatively, if you fundamentally agree with the planning officer, which does happen, you might feel that actually your application and the reasons for it are reasonable. You could attempt to seek it to be determined by planning committee, or otherwise you might accept a refusal of permission and then decide what to do after that. So if your application has been granted, then you're basically free to do the works. You have 3 years to commence them from when the decision comes in. But you might sometimes have what are called conditions of permission. So that means that there's a basic one that's with all permissions, that you need to be compliant with the plans that you submitted. But sometimes you might have a permission subject to other things being submitted, which you need to give to the planning authority before you are able to proceed. If your application is refused, it might be that you accept the reasons for refusal and use it as an opportunity to reflect and learn from that, and come back with an improved scheme that addresses those issues. Or you accept that actually in some cases, because of harm to heritage, for example, those reasons for refusal can't be overcome. Therefore, you need to look at something else altogether. Or you may believe that actually a different officer could reasonably have come to a completely different decision on the same scheme, in which case there is an opportunity to appeal applications. But you do need to be aware that this can be quite a timely, it can take quite a long time, and it can be a very lengthy process that requires a lot of resource to do. Another question is, can you carry out works without permission? In some cases, yes, where there's reasons for urgent reasons of safety. But generally, absolutely, you shouldn't do this. It's an offence to make alterations to listed buildings without consent. And doing so, or carrying out anything that otherwise requires planning permission, risks you being fined and potentially having to undo the work you've done. the picture on there is quite a famous example where a man built a house with a bit of castle feel to it, sealed it with hay bales. Once those hay bales were removed, because he felt he had he'd be able to keep the house because he kept it up a certain number of years. That wasn't actually the law, and he eventually had to demolish the house. So don't be tempted to do works without the appropriate consent. That concludes my quick overview of the planning system. Like I say, if you do have any queries, then do feel free to get in contact with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you for that very kind of quick run through the planning system, but some incredibly detailed and useful information there. And just to reiterate, if anybody's got any queries or wants to pick Tom's brains about anything, please do get in contact. The address you can see there on the screen, planning@theatrestrust.org.uk, or check out the details on our website. I'm now like to introduce our next speaker, Jenny Wetton. Jenny is an independent heritage consultant who specialises in the analysis of historic buildings to assess history and significance. And she's going to explain the finer details of some of the items touched on in Tom's talk, namely heritage statements and also conservation management plans. Jenny, I wonder if we can get you to put your video on so we can spotlight you for the screen, and so I may hand over to you.
I think my video should be on.
Brilliant. We've got you on screen now, Jenny.
Excellent.
Lovely. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. And please accept my apologies if I repeat anything that Tom's just said. So I'm hoping to demystify heritage statements and conservation management plans for you today. So I could have the next slide. Why would you need a heritage statement? Well, as Tom's just said, you need those for any applications for listed building consent or for external works to a building within a conservation area. And they are required under the National Planning Policy Framework for those consents, and they are required to have an assessment of significance and an assessment of the impact of the alterations. And it should also be, the level of detail should be proportionate to the asset's importance and sufficient to understand the impact. So what should you expect to see in there? There should be a history of the site, which should include what we call a map regression, or historic maps set out to show how the building's developed over time. There should be a description of the building, which should include any surviving historic features of architectural or historic interest. And then an assessment of significance. It should include the contribution made by setting. And I assess significance for heritage statements according to the guidance that I've put down at the bottom. And I understand that Davina is going to make links available to that guidance. So having assessed the significance, it's always helpful to have a section which includes the heritage planning context. That's the relevant paragraphs from the National Planning Policy Framework and from the local authority's local plan. You might wonder, well, why am I just repeating the local authority's guidance back at them? But they have a statutory obligation to take the historic importance of the building into account. So it's just worth making sure that it's there for them. Then importantly, there's the heritage impact assessment, and sources are always valuable because it enables somebody to go back to find the source of the information. Could I have the next slide, please? Sometimes it's helpful to have plans which show the different levels of significance within a building. If there are a lot of internal alterations proposed, then it can be helpful to understand the likely impact of the proposals. Next slide, please. So moving on to the impact assessment itself, that should detail all the proposed areas of changes, and all the changes should be clearly shown on architect's drawings as existing and as proposed. The listing covers the whole building, front and back and interior, and any fixtures and fittings, as well as the curtilage. And the curtilage is the whole of the area within the boundary as at July 1948. And that would include any outbuildings. So any work to a curtilage building would also require listed building consent and would affect the setting of the listed building. It just means that you've got more to take into account when you're dealing with a listed building or a building that might be considered to fall within the curtilage. Under the National Planning Policy Framework, impact can be neutral, beneficial or harmful. Just because you're going to create potential harm, it doesn't mean that changes can't be made. It does mean that the harm needs to be fully justified. And as I say, all the changes should be clearly shown on architect's drawings. I've just put up some further Historic England guidance here, which might be helpful on making changes to heritage assets. And that provides guidance on how proposals for change should be treated. And there's quite a helpful section under addition and alteration. Could I have the next slide, please? So looking further at how we can reduce impact, you can try and concentrate changes in areas of lower significance where possible. You should retain and reuse as many historic features as possible, because obviously they are part of the reason why the building was listed. Under the National Planning Policy Framework, harm can be substantial or less than substantial. And substantial harm is a very high bar. That's the equivalent to the demolition of a listed building and requires to be offset by substantial public benefits. Less than substantial harm, which is mostly what I deal with, needs to be weighed against public benefits. And those could include heritage benefits, such as repair and conservation work, reversing previous poor quality work, and bringing neglected areas back into reuse. Could I have the next slide, please? So to move on to conservation management plans, why would you need one of these? It's generally that they're requirements of funding bodies, such as the National Lottery Heritage Fund. They're much more detailed than a heritage statement, much bigger documents. They help to develop a management strategy for the building, importantly, how you're going to look after it in the future. It explains the significance of the building and examines how any future use, management, alteration or repair will be carried out to retain that significance. So it's a very important means of looking at what's important about the building and how we make sure that that's retained for the future. If there is any alterations proposed as a result, as associated with that CMP, I would always say that the impact assessment should be kept separate, so that the CMP can be kept as a body of work on its own. The lottery guidelines suggest that you may want to use a consultant to save time in undertaking detailed research and analysis, as well as writing up the findings. The guidelines alone are 12 pages long. However, I would say you should expect to benefit from specialist input and having an outsider looking at your building in detail. The guidelines also recommend writing a brief, which could be helpful, but I should say I've never had one. And you should expect consultants to give you a method statement about how they propose going about the work, as well as setting out clear information about costs. So I could have the next slide, please. So what should go into a CMP? The lottery content requirements are a summary, an introduction which looks at the circumstances in which the CMP is being put together, usually a big section on understanding the heritage, which again should be a fairly detailed description of the building and its any features of architectural historic interest. Its local context, what the area that it's in is like, and its setting, and are there any other designated assets nearby, anything that contributes to its wider understanding. The history and archaeology of the site. I sometimes put in a section on architectural context because it can help to get a better understanding of how the buildings developed within that building type, and therefore how important it is. And a further section on how the heritage is looked after now, how it's managed. Then the important assessment of significance. And for these, I use the older guidance from Historic England, Conservation Principles, which identifies 4 values that buildings can fall under as evidential, historic, architectural and communal, which should identify what's important about the building and to whom and why. Then an important section on risks and opportunities. What are the issues affecting the building? Are there any problems that you're having it now? That's the opportunity to acknowledge problems that you're having with the building. And are there opportunities for protecting or better revealing the value of the heritage? Are there any, this could also include where you see as making where the building should go in the future, but also that's the, well, what else can we get out of it? Then there's the important management policies which set out how you're going to look after the building in the future. And it's also important to have clear sources. It should be possible for someone else to go back to the sources to see where the information comes from. And CMPs should be updated every 5 years because things change. They need to go for consultation to statutory bodies, which includes Historic England and the Victorian Society or the Georgian Society and the Theatres Trust. Also the local planning authority and stakeholders, and a copy should be sent to the Historic Environment Record as a public record. I should also have added that what you're seeing now is a canal warehouse, and I put that in, but not, well, just because it's an example, because it helps to understand how your building fits into the development of that building type and to understand its importance. Could I have the next slide, please? Yes, so I'm just going to finish with a plea for you to get specialist advice as early in your project as possible. A heritage consultant could help you save architects' time and therefore fees and therefore money in the long run. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was a really informative presentation. It's taught me a huge amount about historic statements and conservation management plans. And I just wanted to pick up something you were saying about the heritage statements, actually, which was that balance of harm versus benefit to a building and how important it is, because change and adaptation is possible, even in grade 1 listed buildings, category A buildings, but you really do need to understand the significance of your building. You really do need to understand the heritage and those kind of levels and layers within, don't you?
Yes, you need to start from an assessment of significance first. What I would always say to people working on changing a historic building is get specialist advice early, get an assessment of significance to understand what's important about the building, and some areas are more important than others. And then hopefully you can use that as a starting point for your scheme design. And then hopefully you can try and concentrate changes in areas of lower significance. And conservation officers are always going to be more sympathetic to significance-led scheme designs rather than something that has started from a need to, a financially led scheme design. So if you can start from a good understanding of the building, then you're on a much better way towards getting consent.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jenny. And just a reminder to everybody that the recording of this event and also the slides will be available afterwards. So I would now like to introduce our final speaker. Chloe Bird is a heritage participation and public engagement consultant with a huge wealth of experience and knowledge in public engagement, learning and community programs. And she's here to speak to us today about the heritage stories that our theatre buildings can tell. Over to you, Chloe.
Brilliant. Thanks, Claire. It's really great to be here today. And my career is really focused on creating bridges between audiences and heritage across a range of settings. And whether this be local authority museums and archives, National Trust properties, or at Historic England, really looking at the wider historic environment. But since becoming freelance, I've worked in a range of cultural organisations, places like South Bank Centre, Bristol Old Vic, Wilton's Music Hall and Chichester Festival Theatre, to name a few. And through this, I've just seen the incredible power that combining the practice of theatres and performing arts with heritage can bring in terms of creatively unlocking the past for people. So that's kind of what I want to touch on today. I want to spend a bit of time sharing some thinking about unlocking broader stories, and particularly bearing in mind that for most theatres, heritage isn't your core business at hand, but at the same time, you have rich and varied stories you can share, and heritage can actually help you with your resilience. After exploring a bit of a definition of heritage, which we'll come on to, I'm then going to touch a little bit more about the heritage stories and assets you can share, think a bit about interpretation, and I will share a couple of case studies along the way as well. So this slide here, I really like this National Lottery Heritage Fund definition of heritage, as it promotes a really broad and inclusive classification of what heritage is. So I'm just going to read it here. The people, things, experiences, memories, and places that are important today and are worth saving for tomorrow. So this can include historic buildings, and that's restoring buildings of the past that will welcome and engage people in the present. Museums, libraries, and archives, so that can be making the collections that they hold more accessible. Community heritage, which really explores people's memories, cultural traditions, dance, food, dialects. Commemorations and celebrations, which focuses on telling the stories and histories of people, communities, places or events related to specific times and dates, for example, anniversaries. Nature and landscapes, and industrial, maritime and transport heritage. I mean, I think the first 4 bullets are the ones that are most relevant for us in terms of when we're thinking about theatres telling broader stories. Could I have the next slide, please? Fantastic. So every organisation story is different, and you really want to be thinking about your unique heritage focus. I think, good questions to ask yourself or to explore with your team to get a clearer sense of where your key heritage stories might lie and where the real strong stories you might want to share are the following. Are there significant people you want to celebrate and place in the spotlight? Are there important places for your organisation that you want to highlight? Are there key moments in time you want to pinpoint? Have there been times when the work of your organisation is linked to significant events locally or nationally? And what are the heritage stories from your organisational history that you'd like to foreground? I think really thinking about distilling the key stories is something that's incredibly important. We're now going to look at a quick case study of Bristol Old Vic. Next slide, please. Fantastic, thank you. So Bristol Old Vic used their 250th birthday and their anniversary as a catalyst for their heritage project. And they had 3 strong heritage themes, which they used that were both inward-looking and outward-looking. And these underpinned how they approached the project. The first heritage theme was about architecture, so unlocking the building's architecture. And this focused on decoding the building, showing the layers of survival and transformation over time. Their second theme was around innovation in theatre making, and this is the great moments on the stage, famous actors, landmark productions, key directors, and the idea of stagecraft and design, so what happens behind the scenes as well. They have a thunder run at Bristol Old Vic, which is extraordinary. It makes a noise of thunder by a ball going down a wooden tube, and it's from right back when the theatre was first opened. It's an extraordinary thing to see. Their final theme is around the theatre and the city, and this is really thinking about their place within the city and the stage reflecting the life and society of the time, the influences of changing tastes, fashions and theatres, and also the link to the theatre to commerce, thinking about the founders of the theatre and where they got their money from, and also thinking about the theatre saviours through times. Now, alongside an absolutely extensive restoration and redevelopment of the physical buildings, there was also a completely unifying set of interpretation that ran throughout the building. So the picture you can see here with all the arrows shows the different sorts of heritage engagement opportunities that were available to people once their project had finished. They used multiple modes of interpretation. So they had, they created a heritage experience throughout the building, It included a large scale projection, which they worked on Ardman, who were local to them, and Limbic Theatre, and that covered the whole wall of one of the foyers. And that was something that was on just before every performance, so people got a sense of the story of the theatre before they went to see their performances. They also created an augmented reality app that you could use, which gave you a window into the past, and you can see the inside of the buildings at different times in their history. They had illustrative timelines and performance timelines. They also have an interactive exhibit about the story of sound, which you can go, and it's very hands-on, which is really great. And in addition to that, they have these temporary community collaboration display spaces. They have a rolling series of exhibitions that use collections and link to contemporary stories. I think what's really great about the work that they did was they really looked at creating it all in collaboration with local people. And whether that was artists, designers, higher education institutions, or community partners, there's this idea that we are going to do this hand in hand with our public. And it meant that there's a really robust and shared storytelling. Next slide, please. So now I just wanted to touch a little bit on the heritage, stories and assets you can draw on to tell your story. Of course, you have your building as a great source. It's fantastic because it's a physical representation. It's a tangible reference point, so it's very easy to talk about. But you can really go beyond that. The next thing I've got on my list is archive. And I think archive records can be your own production and organisational records, but also those held in other places, such as local archives and history centres. The next on my list is objects and personal collections. And these could be, again, yours, but could also be a museum or in a personal collection. I always think of these as the under the bed in the shed treasures. So you'll get things in living memory, and that can be an extraordinary source. And having objects also really brings stories to life because they're vivid, three-dimensional, very evocative for people. We then have photographs, films, and historic newspapers. And why these are really useful is to think about using sources to share your story that also add context to the time that you're sharing. So it might not directly relate to you, but it's that thing of kind of adding colour and a full picture to the stories you're telling. We then have people's memories and oral histories. And again, this idea of living memory and people capturing their experiences of being involved with you, whether that be people who've worked at the theatre, people who've attended performances, or people who built the theatre. I think it's worth noting here, with oral histories, they are a bit more heavy as a resource process. So if you're thinking about collecting new ones, there are formal procedures attached in terms of collection, transcribing and things. But kind of more light touch memory collecting can also be a brilliant source. And what's fantastic about collecting more memories is at the same time, you're raising the profile of your theatre and building excitement with people because you're getting them involved. I've added artworks here to this list of heritage sources, which might seem a bit of a curveball, but I think there are often artworks that are inspired by or reference organisations, and these can be a really, really good way into telling your story for people. And then finally, I have collections and other places that relate to you. I think it's really good to think about your national collections that might relate to you, as well as your more local collections, so it shows your part in bigger historical narratives. The important thing when you're thinking about the assets you're going to draw on to tell your story is that you look for content that's visually rich or that includes quirky and human stories, because what you want to do is add texture and life to the way you're presenting the history. Thank you. Next slide, please. Brilliant. This is my next case study, and it's Wilton's Music Hall in London. And meticulous conservation was at the heart of this project to restore Wilton's. They saved nails, they captured the dereliction and cracks and wears of time and stabilized them and preserved them. And what this means is it creates an incredibly atmospheric end result because all those layers and the kind of wounds of time are present in the building that you can see today. In addition to this, they added a layer of flexible interpretation on top, which contributes to the atmosphere of the place. They did things like using information panels, but rather than straightforward design boards, they looked at making them like playbills, so it referenced their kind of early advertising. They used old cupboards and cabinets that they found in their attics and storerooms during the conservation and repurposed them to create display cases for objects and archive collections. And in many of the rooms where interpretation is present, they use them for other purposes, so the rooms are flexible. What that means is lots of different types of people are getting unexpected encounters with heritage when they come to the theatre. Wilton's also has 60 boxes of archive material. And so during their restoration and heritage projects, they actually worked alongside volunteers in the local study library to digitise these and catalogue them. And that's created a really brilliant long-term resource for them to draw on. I think the last thing to talk about with Wilton's really is the way that they really championed their role as a witness to the changing landscape in their area. So they were present through the Battle of Cable Street, but right through to ongoing regeneration now. And they see themselves as a bit of a beacon holding the story of the community more broadly. Next slide, please. So you've thought of brilliant stories you want to share and with your audiences, your old audiences and your new audiences, but now it's time to look towards how you share them in a dynamic way. And I wanted to look at another definition again, because I think it's useful. Historic England uses the International Council on Monuments and Sites definition of interpretation, and that is the full range of potential activities intended to heighten public awareness and enhance understanding of cultural heritage sites. And I think that's worth really thinking about, because again, it's quite expansive. And your interpretation can take many forms. It can be infrastructure, so displays, exhibitions, interactive exhibits, art installations, or creative signage and wayfinding. But it can also be people-led, and that's something where I think theatres are pretty excellent at. So that could be tours, workshops, performances, events, or co-creative partnership projects. When you're thinking about how you're going to interpret your heritage stories, it's really also worth thinking about digital and resources and how those can help present your story and reach different audiences for you. So that could be online resources, apps, digital collections, blogs, films or trails or leaflets, but also social media as well. Successful interpretation has a number of shared characteristics, and I just thought I'd finish by flagging some of those that I've seen across many of the projects I've worked on. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So firstly, communicate in a way that's accessible, relevant and engaging. I know that's kind of obvious, but I think keeping hold of that idea of clarity and focus and less being more is really, really important, so that people come away with a really clear message. Provoke questions, new discoveries and active engagement for audiences. So this really is about how the way you interpret your heritage and share your broader stories builds curiosity with the audiences you want to reach. Following on from this, thinking about your audiences and their needs first to guide your planning will really help make sure that you draw people in and get them engaged. And following on from this, testing your ideas with visitors and potential audiences is a really good way to make more robust and long-lasting, successful interpretation and a kind of an end result that really works for the people you want to reach. Finally, I think it's important to think about working with partners and drawing the expertise you don't already have. You don't have to know everything, and it may be that there are partners who are really excited to help you. And those could be museum partners, archive partners, but they could be in higher education institutions, so drawing on emerging talent in certain courses where people can come and contribute to supporting sharing your heritage. And you could also think about people who can bring perspectives you don't have. So in terms of how you tell your stories in the broadest way, that's another partnership you might want to think about. But finally, you know, it's about being authentic. Heritage isn't a book on a wall, and you aren't a museum. So play to your strengths, like use the creativity and imagination of theatre craft so that it's in the spirit of your place, because heritage is just another source of inspiration. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Chloe. And I'm sure you've inspired so many of our audiences to go back and reconsider that heritage within the buildings and all those stories they know. I mean, so many of the groups we work with are involved with their buildings because they have such a fond memory of it. You know, it might be that they've performed on the stage or the place where their parents first dated or whatever it may be. So yes, I'm sure you've got a lot of people thinking about how they can kind of take those stories and those collective memories, share them wider and share them dynamically as well. So thank you so much. I'd like to thank all of our speakers today in helping us to demystify the process of or behind building projects and really helping us in a greater understanding of heritage projects. So thank you all.